Welcome to Unsolicited Book Reviews with Michael David MacBride. Hey, that's me! Typically, this is a part where I would do more of an intro and tell you what to expect, but this is a special episode where I chat with someone kind of long form about a book. So, my buddy Anthony joins me, and we're going to chat about a book about the Beatles. Ready? Let's go! Hey, thanks for joining us. I'm here with my buddy, friend Anthony, college mates, I guess graduate school college
Graduate
mates,
school,
really.
yeah.
And you've gone on to continue teaching, where I have kind of gone into a different path. But we've always shared this love of music. And when I was talking about books that we might talk about, you proposed, wait, what? The Beatles Couldn't Read Music by Dan Gutman. So first of all, welcome. Thanks for joining, and thanks for recommending this. This is not a book I had ever heard of before. How did you come across it?
Well, thanks for having me, Michael. Good to see you again. Yeah, my kids actually got it at the Scholastic uh, book fair at their school. Um, my kids both know that I'm obsessed with the Beatles and the Beach Boys and all the '60s music, but the Beatles primarily. And so I think my youngest son saw it because it has a picture of the four Beatle faces on the cover, and he bought it as one of his books at the Scholastic Book Fair and came home and read it, and we read it together, and just had a blast reading it. It's a really good sort of introduction primer to the Beatles for kids. So
Yeah, I love those Scholastic book fairs. It's always funny to put money in the hands of kids and see what they come up with. And if you take them to a bookstore, there's often so many books, but like the
yeah,
Scholastic Fair pares it down so that it's like manageable, I think. And I always loved seeing what they come up with. Because
yeah,
this, though I am also a fan of the Beatles, I don't know that this would have. It probably would have stood out to me, I guess, among like the other, like Percy Jackson's and the I Survived
yeah.
books and whatever else the Scholastic Book Fair has. But yeah, I'm glad they grabbed those. It's Have you seen any of the other in the series? Because I guess he also did one about like Einstein and Muhammad Ali, and so it's also kind of reminded me of there's a series about who was or what is that kind
Yeah,
of
the Who
series.
Was books.
Uh,
Yeah.
have you guys read any of the others now that you've come across the Beatles one?
I haven't read any of these. I do want to check out Teddy Roosevelt Was a Moose. That one does certainly seem could be a good one. But no, we haven't read any in this series. But yeah, I think its biggest competitor would be the Who Was series, which my kids do read. Um, and I tend to prefer this to the Who Was books a little bit, but it's certainly in that same vein of the sort of nonfiction books aimed at kids that kind of emphasize sort of strange trivia or strange facts to kids. So, but no, I haven't read any of them. I definitely will check out some now, but we had a lot of fun reading this one.
Yeah, I'm definitely gonna dig in there. I really enjoyed. I mean, some of them are Lucille Ball had no eyebrows, which is kind of a funny one.
Mhm.
And then Ruth Bader Ginsburg couldn't drive, which reminds me of like my grandmother who couldn't drive or didn't never learned to drive, which I just think
Yeah.
is kind of like an interesting tidbit. But I do I feel like these books or the Who Was books do a really nice job of kind of capturing some of the fun that's in history that gets
Yes,
left out of teaching history. But I don't know.
absolutely.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was gonna say that, like, I was reading the description of the other one in this series by Dan Gutman, that Teddy Roosevelt was a moose, and one of the things that it emphasizes is that story about Teddy Roosevelt where he got shot and then gave a speech, because the speech actually folded up in his pocket, stopped the bullet, and then he went and gave the speech anyway. That's like one of the big things that I was just thinking of, like, in like an 8 hour Ken Burns documentary for adults. That story is tucked in there because it's fun, but it's not the main thrust of the narrative. And I do sort of like that these books for kids kind of take those little fun factoids that would be buried in the middle of an 8 hour, Ken Burns documentary and kind of push it forward and make that the sort of framework that the story is sort of built around or revolves around, which I think is a great idea for kids.
Yeah,
Some of
that
the, go ahead.
I was just going to say the structure of this was really interesting because it's
Hmm.
like two siblings essentially having a nerd off. Like, who knows
Yes.
the most abstract kind of thing, right?
Yes.
And I thought that was kind of interesting. It wasn't what I expected. Again, coming into it completely cold, I was like, oh, it's a book about the Beatles. This will be like a straightforward kind of biography or whatever, with some kind of trivia along the way and whatever. But I kind of like that dialogue between them. It was kind of fun and playful. Um, uh,
Yeah, siblings Page and Turner, or Turner and Page, I guess. And they, yeah, they have like a, that's a good way of putting it. They have kind of a nerd off, and it's sort of written in this like almost like text style of dialogue balloons, almost kind of going
yeah.
back and forth, which is I think that sort of narrative history style that you see. I see quite a bit. I mean, even in like adult books like Daisy Jones and the Six is kind of written in that way, that sort of narrative documentary style where it's just people sort of talking, um, almost like a dialogue collage, I guess you could call it. But yeah, it's a really
I like
interesting
that.
structure. Yeah, and
I
like,
like dialogical.
well, it's not typically the way that it's not that what I would prefer. I enjoyed Daisy Jones and the Six, but when I first saw that that's how it was written, I was like, I don't know about this. I don't know if I want to plunge into this. But it turned out okay. But in that case, but um, my kids had no problem. It was like I think for them it was just natural. It was like this is how we talk as kids. This is what we're used to. They're more used to sort of text and chats and things with their friends. That so it wasn't anything weird to them. Whereas to me, I was like, oh, this is kind of a unique structure. But to them, it's just that's just the book. That's how we talk. So
Yeah, I remember reading somewhere once about how like, it was probably a fiction craft class where they were talking about dialogue tags, he said, she said, whatever kind of stuff. And the comment was just make them plain and boring because nobody reads them anyway. Like they become invisible after
yeah,
a while. And the little bubble heads in this essentially take the place of that vocal tag. Like you don't need to say, Page said or Turner said or whatever. It's just here's his face. Turner is speaking, which is kind of a clever, again to me, but perhaps not novel to children. So,
yeah.
but um, as a huge Beatles nerd, though, the question I was most curious was, did you learn anything from this book? Because like you know more and retain more Beatles trivia than anybody else I know.
Yeah, there were a few things that I was like, oh, I didn't know that, or maybe they told something that I did know and expanded on it, or gave more um, sort of clarity to something that I didn't know. But I was just looking through it, and there's some things. There's a chapter we were talking about the structure earlier. There's a chapter on each of them. There's a chapter on John, Paul, George, and then Ringo. Um, and that kind of makes up the middle part of the book. And those chapters I found very informative because I didn't, that's the stuff in a big rock book. When you get a big Beatles book or something that's 600, 800 pages, and they get into the background of each person. That's where my attention wanes. But here, I think because of the structure of the book and the way that the dialogue that we're talking about, it just kind of kept me going, and so I did learn a lot about each of the Beatles in their kind of early days, and just I knew Ringo grew up very sickly, but it really emphasized some of the specifics about how long he was in the hospital and appendix
And how
burst.
many times, like for
Yeah,
different things. It's like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that. Uh,
and for like 16 weeks he was in a coma, and I mean, yeah, some of that stuff I didn't really know. So it's mostly the kind of biographical stuff. When they got into my specialty, which I think is the recording stuff, because I've read a lot about that, like tidbits about the studio and recording and things. That was all interesting, but not new to me necessarily.
Yeah, I honestly, when I started reading the book and it was back and forth with just trivia, I was like, how are they going to sustain this? And then I
Yeah,
was kind of relieved that then there were the biographies because it felt like then there was kind of like some meat that I could kind of sink my teeth
yeah,
into a bit. And like you said, it was refreshing to read them in such a unique perspective because they were definitely abbreviated. They weren't a
Yeah.
600 page book, like you said.
Right.
And yet they were all of these. I don't know. It made me think of like The Princess Bride, the novel. The long title is just the good parts, and
Oh
like
yeah.
at the beginning of each chapter, it says like what you're not reading here are 600 pages describing all the princess's hats. And so like this felt like just the
Yeah.
good parts. It was like here's all the interesting nuggets of John's life and Paul's life and Ringo's life and George's life. And it was interesting to see it that way because you're right. Usually, in a more straightforward narrative kind of biography, you have to weed through the story of family history and like like the job they had and all. And this, it was like they worked here, and then this thing happened, and then this other thing, and then it just kind of it moved very quickly, and I could see it as being it was engaging to me, so I could imagine it being
Yeah.
engaging to kids as well. So
Yeah, it doesn't go in chronological order. It kind of gives you an introduction to the Beatles. There's a early chapter on what your teacher wants you to know, which is kind of a standard timeline. Stuff your teacher wants you to know about the Beatles. And then they jump into a couple chapters on their fame and Beatlemania. Um, and then it goes into the four chapters on each person. And then they go into the albums, the songs. And I just thought that's such a refreshing way to do it. Because you and I, we've talked about rock books before, right? Rock biographies, and just there is that standard of like rust you into the craziness at the beginning, get your attention, get you hooked, and then okay, now we've multiple chapters about growing up and that you don't care about as much as being in the band and making the album and all the touring and madness and that follows. And this kind of avoided that because it broke that chronological structure. It just sort of went a different path, and maybe this is because it's more trivia than it is like a sustained kind of narrative, but it still worked really well, and
I
definitely
agree.
for kids. I mean,
Yeah, the one thing that weirdly, I don't know, I read things and it's almost always like kind of a throwaway thing that I think that attracts me for whatever reason. And so there was a moment where they talked about Ringo's love of jelly beans and how jelly beans in the UK were soft. And when they came to America, they're hard and they just like they pelted them with them and how much it hurt. And I was like, what? There's a difference between jelly beans? So I looked it up and like it's not actually jelly beans. In the things that Ringo liked were called jelly babies, and
Jelly Babies, yeah.
they were more like gummy bears.
Mm-hmm.
So they were softer anyway than our jelly beans. And anyway, so there's funny little things like that that you could if I were to challenge my kids, like, okay, find something that you don't know about in this book and,
Yeah,
do an additional, because that's the kind of crap I do, like
yeah.
I assign things and tasks to my children as well. So, but yeah,
Yeah, I mean that's what I was thinking about when I was reading it is, even before we read this, and I try to brainwash my kids with Beatles music and stuff. The stuff that I focused on when, we're listening in the car is I would focus on those strange kind of fun facts about them. Like I would tell them the story about how when they're recording Tomorrow Never Knows, and John wanted to sound like he was singing from a mountaintop, right? And he asked to be suspended by a rope, and then an engineer, swing him around and put the microphone in the center of the room, and then he'll sing as he's being swung around. Stuff like that. I would tell them stories, and they would just think that's hilarious and fascinating. And that's in the book. That page 45, they talk about that in John's chapter. So it's just funny, like the approach that I had when I was trying to teach my kids about the Beatles is what this does is kind of take those funny stories and put them up front and make them front and center. Um,
I always do those kind of things too. It's funny. I think it's part of why we connect on music because we enjoy those stories as well.
yeah.
So the one for me it was always the twist and shout story. Like
Oh yeah.
we're recording. John wants to record twist and shout, but they know that if he does that, he's going to break his voice. And like so they like keep pushing it off, and then finally like it's the last day of recording, and they're like, all right, go to town. And you can hear his vocal cords like ripping towards the end of that song,
Oh
and it's
yeah.
just incredible. And I love that they included that in here as well. So um, there's that. I don't know, it's that combination of like joy and um, excitement and experimentation, I think, for me, is one of the things that's always worked with the Beatles. And this
Mhm.
little book does a pretty good job of capturing a lot of those components. Um,
Absolutely, and kind of an understanding of the author Dan Gutman and the illustrator too. We haven't mentioned the illustrations, but the illustrations by Allison Steinfeld. Um, they have a really good sense of, you can tell they're Beatles fans themselves because they have an understanding of the Beatles sense of humor. There's a lot of kind of goofy wordplay that happens between Page and Turner. Like at the end of the book, they're talking, and he says, you never told me your favorite Beatles song. And Page says, wait, with quotes around it, meaning favorite song is wait. And he says, I've been waiting. And she says, I'm so tired. Do you want to lie down? I feel fine. Good. What's your favorite Beatles song? Right. And it goes on like that, that kind of goofy Beatles wordplay. And and then the illustrations too remind me of a lot of goofy doodles that you would see in, on Beatles album covers or in John's like poetry books and stuff. You would see all these kind of little doodles in the corner, and that's what that reminded me of. Is like it's just perfect for a Beatles book. And I'm sure the illustrator is the same on the other books too, but it just fits the Beatles so well. Um, these little goofy illustrations in the corner of a page.
it really does. Yeah, I was fortunate enough to go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame when they had exhibit specific to John,
Oh yeah.
and they had like the original lyrics to a bunch of songs, and I think they even maybe had his piano that he did Imagine on, and um, anyway, it was very cool. And but my favorite thing I think was probably seeing the doodles, like the
Mhm.
handwritten things and the doodles were always something that I enjoyed. They seem whimsical, but it's also kind of part of the creative process, I think. Like you get stumped or you're in the process of something else and you're just kind of drawing on the page or sometimes the art reflects the music, it goes
Yeah.
back and forth. And so I agree. I mean, I think the style in here was really good and it captured kind of funny moments like the first harmonica.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so what did the boys think? I mean, they picked this out. Did they come away from it going like, yeah, that was a good purchase? So they're like, oh, I should have got something else.
They were very happy with the purchase, and in fact, I will admit, and maybe this is part of the just the style, like we're talking about the sort of dialogue between the brother and sister. Um, Towards the end, I did get a little bit. I felt it was a little repetitive because when you get into chapters 10, 11, there's a chapter that's just random facts about the Beatles albums, and it's like, okay, like, but once you get in there, it's like, oh, this is actually pretty fun and pretty funny. But my kids were always asking for it. I said, let's take a break on that, and no, 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 let's get through it. Let's get through it. So, I have one kid that's really into rock music. My youngest plays guitar. He likes all the stuff that I can sort of push his way. And then my older one won't have any of it. He doesn't really like a lot of it. He does like some Beatles and Beach Boys and stuff, but um, he mostly likes things like soundtracks and musicals and stuff. So, but even he really liked this a lot. He was the one who was asking for it quite a bit. And so I think
That's
it
cool.
his attention. Yeah, so they really liked it. I think they were happy of the purchase. We tried a number of Beatles books before, like the Who Was book, and I don't think we got through Who Were the Beatles. We didn't get through that one. And then there was like a kind of Where's Waldo, Where Are the Beatles book, which um, we did a couple pages, but that's not really a story. That's not really a narrative, so we didn't stick with that one either. So this is the first one I think we got all the way through and we're happy about. So
Cool. Yeah, it's funny. I was thinking, hearing you kind of talk, just about like how you inspire your kids and share things with them, and then just also how they react differently to things as well. Like mine, definitely the same deal. Like, one will absolutely latch onto something. But I was even thinking back to my childhood and like so much of the music of my childhood was like classic rock or oldies. And then
yeah.
oldies was more rockabilly, like 50s to 60s. And then classic rock was more the late 60s into, late 70s kind of stuff. And weirdly, for whatever reason, my dad did not like the Beatles. And so the Beatles almost always got turned off when I was a kid,
Oh,
or the channel got changed. And because inevitably he described them as being too weird. So he was okay with like the Twist and Shout covers and like the
okay.
things earlier, less so with any of the stuff I ended up really enjoying later. But
Right.
it was kind of funny to hear that, and for me to know like it wasn't forbidden, but it definitely was something that inspired me to like, what are those Beatles all about? Clearly they're inspiring lots of other people, just not my dad. So I'm curious, I guess, really to ask you the question is like, do you have a memory of the first Beatles song you listened to, or who turned you on to music like that?
Well, see, my mom was the one who turned me on to it, and she still has all of her Beatles records. That was sort of her like teenage years, sort of the early 60s and early mid 60s. And so similar to your dad, my mom has all of the early Beatles singles, I think starting with I Want to Hold Your Hand, She Loves You, when they came to America, um, up to Strawberry Fields Forever, and then her collection stops. So she also did not like when things got a little weird. But also I think by that time she was kind of about to get married and she was an adult, so I think that probably had something else to do with it as well. But um, yeah, so it's got to be. I think it's got to be. Ticket to Ride was probably the one that probably not the first one I heard, but the one that I thought, my ears perked up and I was like, wow, this, and to this day when I hear it, it's like I got to hear the whole thing because it just sounds so great still. It's everything just works so well on that song. So that was probably the first one where I was like, oh man, I like a band that my mom likes. I don't know how I feel about that. But I mean, this was the time of Vanilla Ice and MC Hammer, and so the Beatles just seemed like a better alternative to what was happening, what all my friends were listening to at the time. Um, so that's sort of how I got into it. Interesting is my mom loved the Beatles, or early Beatles, really, but did not like the Beach Boys at all. So that was
Interesting.
later. That was the one where I was like, "Ooh, I'm gonna listen. I'm gonna. What's forbidden here? What does she did not like?" Um, so that's kind of interesting. But yeah, that was for me. It was Ticket to Ride, and I had a music teacher in eighth grade who did a whole semester on rock music, but spent a lot of time on the Beatles, um, and just kind of going through. And some of the stories that he told are ones that are in this book. A lot of the tidbits and stuff that he shared. So it was sort of my mom and my eighth grade music teacher, um, who had a very big curly mullet. And played in like an 80s like band called Colony or something like that, or the Colonists or something like that. And they all wore matching jackets because they were all teachers at my school. Um, Between the eighth grade music teacher and my mom, I got my love of the Beatles. Um,
Yeah.
and it's just interesting that, when we were growing up, there weren't books like this. There weren't books about the Beatles. They were all for adults. There wasn't any kid books. It's just funny to see now so many books aimed at kids that try to get them into things that their parents or grandparents liked.
Yeah. Well, and I think I don't know. My memory is definitely tainted by time, I suppose, but I don't
Yeah.
remember a lot of books about pop culture in general. Like as a kid, it was like there were lots of fantasy books for sure. There were lots of um, kind of moralistic kind of stories.
Yeah.
If you were lucky, you could get one of those books that was like a um, I can't remember what they're called, but like the Indiana Jones book that came out before the movie
Oh
that
yeah,
had like an extra chapter in there that wasn't
novelizations.
actually,
Yeah.
yeah, the novelizations, like those were kind of the closest that I remember to something kind of like this that was like something that I would have been more interested in
Yeah.
reading. But it's like you said. I mean, I don't remember there being kid biographies. Like if you wanted to read a biography, there's one over there. Go read that. It's perfectly fine.
Right.
And if you're not ready for it, then oh well. Like
Yeah, I mean, I had to do a piece in school on Eleanor Roosevelt, and I couldn't find an Eleanor Roosevelt book my age, and my grandma had one, and because that was her era, and she loved Eleanor Roosevelt, and I remember my grandmother reading me this giant biography. Like that's how I did my report on Eleanor Roosevelt. I never actually read the book. My grandma read this giant book to me. Um, and I'm sure there were ones out there, but I think when we were growing up, I think the emphasis was so much on fiction, and librarians and teachers kind of pushing that, thinking that that's what we liked. But there were some of us who liked nonfiction, and I'm sure there was stuff out there, and I'm sure people will say, "Oh, what about this? What about that?" But I don't remember a lot of series and things. It was like if you wanted to learn about something factual, go to the big encyclopedia set that's in the study in your dad's office and do your
Yeah.
report that way.
And I definitely found a set of encyclopedias that somebody else was throwing away, and I brought them all home, much to my parents' joy, I'm sure.
Yeah,
And I did. I would read through those. I mean, it was very dry, and I didn't read them from start to finish, but like I found that like there were lots of things I was curious about. Like, tell me about this random animal. I was fascinated with snakes, and like at the time, like there was like Ranger Rick magazines, and then there certainly were books kind of geared towards kids about snakes, but they're always like the same stupid things over and over again.
yeah,
And so like I wanted something bigger and meatier, but not quite, a herpetology guide or something like
right.
that. So the encyclopedia was often the closest I got to something that was distilled and manageable, but gave me something kind of interesting. Um, in fact, weirdly enough, in high school, I was a terrible student. And I found in our school library, which the librarian must have known about. I can't remember what it was called. I should look it up at some point, but it was a book that had summaries of other books. And so whenever I was assigned a novel in my literature classes, I went to that book and I wrote my book report. And I never read any of the books in high school at all, which is hilarious because I go
Yeah,
on to love literature
right,
and
right.
like read voraciously. But in high school, could not be bothered. Like I remember the Pearl, and the Pearl was only like this big, and I was just like, I can't be bothered with this book.
Like a anthology of Cliff Notes or something.
It was, yeah, it was something. It had, I remember somebody telling me about it at one time, and I was like, I think our library has that, and I found it, and it I want to say it was to prep for. I mean, it was probably to prep for like a GRE subject test or something like that, because
Oh,
it just had like all of these fairly short but weirdly detailed
yeah.
summaries of books, and it was recent enough that, and the books they were teaching in high school were old enough that I was covered for everything we did. So, but
But that's
um,
I think that's what's so great now is this emphasis on these nonfiction slash history books series for kids. I mean, we mentioned Who Was and Wait What, and my older son's really into Nathan Hale's Hazardous Tales, which are graphic novels that really focus on different points of history and military history and things. And so I think it's such a nice thing to see now that there's so much emphasis on that for kids that if they want to read nonfiction, they can read nonfiction. Or if they're in the history, they can really dive into it. And the fact that this is really well done. Just to get back to this for a minute is the way that this could have. I think this could have failed pretty miserably. The Beatles do have a lot of those funny, goofy little tidbits about them, and John wanting to be suspended from the studio ceiling and being pelted with jelly beans and all kinds of goofy stuff. But they make it, the author makes it work and the illustrator make it work. I mean, they really thread it together to form a story. And they do sort of emphasize, I tell this with my own students too, is that, the so what, right? It's like, why are you writing this? And why are you doing this analysis? And this does a really nice job early on to sort of emphasize the so what. Why does all of these little tidbits matter? And it does sort of thread them together. So I think that's really an important thing. It's like these are all funny little stories, but if they're not sort of weighted and given sort of context, then I think kids are going to sort of tune out. And that's why, this one stuck with my kids, whereas maybe the Who Was book about the Beatles did not as much. So,
Yeah, if I had one disappointment about the book, it was that it didn't spend much more time talking about the title, about them not being able to read
yes.
music. Because I mean, the implication there that I get from that is like the Beatles couldn't read music, and look what they did. You can too. Was
Yeah.
kind of really what I was hoping, and so I was hoping there was more of, I mean, not a blueprint to follow, but like how do you do that? Like, how do
Yeah.
you, yeah. And they do kind of talk about like, they pick up the instruments and they just kind of play with them and,
Yeah.
they experiment and they try to mimic and, they do all these different things. But like, I almost felt like since it's the title, it needed to have a little more of a presence that I wanted. But
Agreed. Yeah, it was sort of, and I remember getting to that in the book and thinking, that's it? That's all they're going to give to the title, you know? Um, whereas I thought that could have been kind of the first thing up front, right? But, and have a takeaway for that. But yeah, I agree. I did, was a little disappointed by that. And like I said, I think some of the last couple chapters, I felt dragged a little bit, just because it was a little repetitive of like, here's some more facts. But they do get into the impact of the Beatles, and again, those early chapters are really well done. I mean, the chapter on each one of them emphasizes um, the sort of genius of all four of them. They even mention like some people think that Ringo wasn't that talented, but that's incorrect, and I think that's a really nice approach. I keep bringing up the Beach Boys, but I heard somebody say in a Beach Boys podcast, you know, um, I think it was Sail On, the Beach Boys podcast, and somebody said, we love the Beach Boys here, obviously, because we're a Beach Boys podcast, but when you compare them to the Beatles, there's really no comparison. You can't compare a band of four geniuses to a band with one genius. It just doesn't work. And that's what this book I think emphasizes, is that this is really a band of four geniuses. And look what they did, and look what you can do too if you're inclined to do music. So it does have a good lesson, but I agree certain parts do get sort of buried under the sort of deluge of tidbits. But
yeah, and I do like that they included some of the solo work afterwards as well,
Mhm.
because it was a nice way to it just kind of end that story. Like they went on to do their own things as
Yeah,
well. And I mean, that could be its own kind of conversation, but I hadn't, it's funny to hear somebody from a Beach Boys podcast admit that, because I feel
yeah,
like that is always, that's always one of like the big 60s arguments is,
yeah.
the better band or the better album. And, obviously you could go down that path a long way, but um, yeah. Well, thanks for introducing me to Wait, What? The Beatles Couldn't Read Music by Dan Gutman. Totally recommend it. Good for kids and adults. So, but
Absolutely, yeah.
yeah.
I
Yeah.
read on the some of the Amazon reviews. I was curious to see what some of the reviews would say, and there are some people on there who said, as an adult, I learned a lot, or I read this on my own and really liked it. So I think if you're really, really a big Beatles sort of fan, then you might want to check it out. But definitely, if you have kids and want to get them into the Beatles, this is a good way to do it, because it is kind of their language. It's sort of catered to them and their sensibilities. So I think um, you know, like I said, I told my kids all this kind of stuff in the car, and then we're reading this, and they'll say, "You never told us that. This is hilarious." Like, of course I told you this, but they do it better than I do, I guess. So, um,
Well, and sometimes you need to hear it from a third party. I find like, as parents, you can tell your kids stuff until you're blue in the face, but then they'll hear it from a friend or a neighbor and they'll be like, oh, suddenly it makes sense. It's like,
right,
at least you got the message. I mean, that's all I
yeah,
care about at the end of the day.
fair, yeah. So, but thank you for having me. Thank you for letting me talk about this and the Beatles and all kinds of things. And I forgot to mention I'm actually wearing a Beatles shirt, and I know you're a fan of three-quarter sleeves, so I broke out
I
my
noticed.
three-quarter sleeves Beach Boy shirt just for the occasion. So,
Well, and behind you, it looks like Sergeant Pepper is sitting there as well. So,
oh yes, yeah, that's the one. For some reason, That's the one sort of summer album, Beatles album. I hit a lot. Maybe because it came out in the summer. It came out in June of '67, and um, but the other ones I associate more with fall. Maybe
Me too, actually.
because like Rubber Soul, maybe because they're all in their coats and it's more acoustic based, and and Beatles for Sale and ones like that where they kind of look all bundled up um, and they're more acoustic driven. But yeah, Sergeant Pepper for some reason strikes me as kind of a summer of love record. So that's the one I break out in the summer.
It starts out so crisp and just like vibrant. And I
Mm-hmm.
think, yeah, I mean, the cover really encapsulates it as well. I mean, that's just
Yeah.
kind of, I agree. I mean, it's a very summery, very fresh, very lively album where, the other ones strike me as, um, yeah, more fall, more wintry, more introspective. Um, Not that they don't have their moments, but yeah, anyway.
Well, yeah, I mean, the summer is the one, I think the one season where the Beach Boys sort of win, and my record player anyway, and then the Beatles sort of take over fall, winter, and early spring. So
Yeah, for sure.
yeah.
Well, thanks for joining me, Anthony.
Um,
Thanks for listening. You can find out more about me at my webpage, michaelmacbride.com, or on most social media platforms with the same handle, at Michael MacBride. That's MacBride, like Mac and Bride. Let me know what you're listening to, or if you read one of these books, leave me a comment and let me know what you thought. Have a great day.